The scent of heavy, expensive perfume that was not hers still clung to the lapels of his bespoke charcoal suit as the underworld king stepped out of the freezing metropolitan rain. Vincent Moretti pushed open the towering iron-wrought double doors of his fortified mansion, fully expecting the suffocating, predictable silence of his arranged marriage to wash over him. He thrived on that quiet submission. He anticipated his wife to be waiting somewhere in the shadows of the grand foyer, her head bowed, pretending she knew nothing of his public infidelities or the cruel dismissals he had voiced earlier that evening. The cavernous entryway was bathed in the dim, golden glow of imported crystal chandeliers, casting long, sharp shadows across the pristine imported marble floors. He unbuttoned his jacket with a fluid, predatory grace, the cold ambient temperature of the isolated estate biting into his skin, despite the heavy layers of wool and silk. He paused at the base of the sweeping spiral staircase, waiting for the soft, hesitant sound of her footsteps. He waited for the faint rustle of her modest dresses, the quiet sigh of a woman who had accepted that her husband's wealth bought her total compliance. The silence stretched, unbroken and absolute. It was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping household. It was the heavy pressurized vacuum of an abandoned fortress. His polished Oxford shoes clicked rhythmically against the stone as he ascended the stairs, a faint pulse of irritation tightening his jaw. He hated when she altered her routine. He pushed open the heavy oak doors to the master suite, expecting to find her curled on the edge of the massive, silk-draped bed, waiting for his permission to sleep. The room was dark, freezing, and entirely empty. The ambient hum of the climate control system was the only sound greeting him, pushing chilled air over the antique furniture. He reached for the brass switch, flooding the room with harsh, immediate light that reflected off the gilded mirrors. The pristine white bedsheets were perfectly smooth, undisturbed by any weight. The closet doors stood slightly ajar, revealing the empty wooden hangers where her simple, unbranded coats usually hung beside his meticulous row of tailored Italian garments. There were no hastily packed bags, no dropped items on the floor, no lingering scent of her cheap drugstore shampoo. The total stillness of the room triggered a primal, hyper-vigilant cognitive loop in his mind. He moved with sudden, staccato urgency toward the center of the room, his tactical instincts flaring to life. There, resting precisely in the center of his massive dark mahogany desk, was a single source of reflected light. The man stepped closer, the rhythmic ticking of his platinum watch suddenly sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. It was a platinum wedding band. The simple, unadorned circle of metal sat abandoned on the polished wood, stripped of all its supposed permanence. It was not discarded in anger or thrown against a mirror. It was placed there with cold, calculated precision, a silent execution of their vows. Beside the ring lay a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the official embossed crest of his private medical facility. Vincent reached for the paper, his massive, scarred fingers suddenly feeling clumsy and numb against the thick stock. He pulled the document free. It was a clinical medical diagnostic report, signed less than 24 hours ago by Dr. Julian Ward, the syndicate's most trusted physician. The forensic terminology blurred together for a fraction of a second before the bold, inescapable conclusion anchored his vision. Valerie had fainted the previous afternoon. Her blood panels were attached. The boldest line of text leaped off the page, striking him with the force of a physical blow. Patient is 12 weeks pregnant. Gestational development normal. Immediate stress reduction required. The paper trembled in his grip as a wave of sudden, visceral terror crashed through his nervous system. 12 weeks. She was carrying his blood, his only legal heir, breathing and growing right beneath his roof, while he spent his evenings parading another woman through the city. He felt his knees lock, a cold sweat tracing a rigid line down his spine as the air was sucked from his lungs. His pupils dilated violently, adjusting to a new, terrifying reality where he was suddenly entirely vulnerable. The woman he treated as a fragile porcelain accessory had heard every cruel word he spoke about their loveless union. She had quietly packed her bags, removed the heavy chain of his name from her finger, and walked out into the freezing night carrying his entire future. The absolute predator of the city's underworld stood paralyzed in the center of his gilded cage, staring at the clinical proof that he had just destroyed his own world. The heavy, suffocating silence of the master suite was violently shattered by the sound of sprinting footsteps, echoing up the marble staircase. The heavy oak doors blew open, rebounding off the plaster wall with a sharp crack that snapped Vincent from his paralyzed trance. Marco Diaz, his lead enforcer, and the architect of his physical security empire, stood in the threshold. Marco was a man forged in tactical precision, a ghost who never breached the private quarters without a direct, formal summons unless the syndicate was actively burning to the ground. Right now, the seasoned enforcer looked entirely drained of blood, his chest heaving under his tactical vest, his dark eyes locked in a state of absolute, unprecedented panic. Marco did not offer a formal greeting. He closed the distance between the doorway and the mahogany desk in 3 rapid strides, thrusting a glowing, military-grade encrypted tablet into his boss's rigid hands. The screen was flashing a relentless cascade of red alert banners, accompanied by the chaotic scrolling of foreign routing numbers and offshore banking codes. Vincent forced his dilated pupils to focus on the digital chaos, his mind struggling to transition from the domestic horror of the medical diagnostic report to the sudden tactical crisis unfolding on the glass screen. The numbers were rapidly depreciating, draining in massive localized bursts. His Cayman Island reserves, the untraceable Swiss vaults, the primary operational liquid funds used to arm his men and bribe the city's political infrastructure, they were all hitting zero in real time. Vincent swiped a trembling finger across the interface, attempting to trigger the manual override protocols he had memorized years ago. The system denied him instantly, flashing a black screen with a single, highly complex encrypted lock code. It was the Aegis cipher key. The breath hitched in Vincent's throat as the realization slammed into him, far more devastating than any physical bullet tearing through his Kevlar. The Aegis cipher key was a custom, impenetrable hardware security module designed specifically for the highest level of corporate espionage. It was a digital fortress that actively hunted and destroyed counter-breach attempts. He had only ever seen that specific, elegant code architecture once before, years ago, built by a brilliant, quiet cybersecurity analyst he had married purely for convenience and territorial alliance. Valerie. He had completely forgotten who she was before he confined her to the shadows of this mansion. He had treated her like a helpless, uneducated dependent, a woman who only knew how to pour his coffee and endure the insults of his high society mistress. He had been entirely blinding himself to the lethal intellectual competence she hid behind her quiet, obedient demeanor. She had not been enduring his cruelty. She had been quietly mapping his entire digital empire. Marco stepped back, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely masked his terror. He reported that the accounts were completely locked. Every primary offshore reserve, the phantom routing numbers, the payroll pipelines had been drained. They were effectively cut off from their own infrastructure. The ghost protocols were activated internally, from inside this very network, less than an hour ago. Vincent lowered the tablet slowly, the cold weight of the titanium device feeling like an anchor dragging him into an abyss. His hands shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor he could not suppress. Dropping the tablet onto the polished wood, he looked from the flashing red zeros on the cracked screen to the simple platinum wedding band, resting delicately beside the medical diagnostic report. The magnitude of her retaliation was absolute. She had not simply run away in a fit of hysterical tears, seeking refuge with friends or low-level family members. Valerie had executed a flawless, surgical strike against the very foundation of his power, ensuring he had no financial leverage to track her, bribe local authorities, or dispatch his private hunting teams. By locking down his untraceable funds, she had effectively paralyzed the most dangerous syndicate in the Midwest, using nothing but her own terrifying intellect and a remote digital terminal. She had severed his strings, leaving him a king of a dead, frozen empire. The untouchable underworld king felt his throat close, a suffocating wave of pure, unfiltered panic rising in his chest. She was out there in the freezing darkness, entirely alone, carrying a 12-week-old child that belonged to him. And she had just taken billions of dollars of illicit syndicate capital with her, painting a massive target on her back for every rival family in the country. Vincent squeezed his eyes shut, the scent of the rain and his own cold sweat mixing into a sickening cocktail of regret. He had pushed his brilliant, pregnant wife to the absolute edge of despair, and in return, she had burned his empire to the ground on her way out the door. The hunt had to begin tonight, not for revenge, but for the desperate, pathetic hope of her mercy. The low, rhythmic hum of liquid-cooled servers filled the vast expanse of the fortified downtown penthouse. 30 stories above the rain-slicked streets, bulletproof windows offered a panoramic view of a city fracturing under her command. Valerie sat bathed in the sharp, sterile blue light of an ultra-wide monitor, her slender fingers suspended over a mechanical keyboard. She did not look like the submissive, invisible shadow who had spent the last 2 years quietly, pouring coffee, and enduring condescending whispers. Stripped of the modest, unbranded dresses her husband had preferred, she wore a simple, structured black cashmere sweater, her posture rigid and fiercely disciplined. Inserted securely into the primary terminal was her custom hardware, the Aegis cipher key, pulsing with a faint, steady red light as it dictated the financial ruin of the Midwest's most feared syndicate. On the expansive digital display before her, the infrastructure of the Moretti organization was mapped out in cascading nodes of data. She watched with cold, clinical detachment as frantic red alerts blossomed across the screen. Vincent's IT division was desperately scrambling to reclaim the operational funds she had already severed. It was a pathetic, chaotic effort. Valerie tapped a single key, permanently locking them out of the mainframe. The screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving green, confirming the total digital quarantine. She was an absolute sovereign in this space, dictating the terms of her own survival through lines of impenetrable code. A sudden, sharp ache radiated through her lower back, a harsh reminder of her physical vulnerability. Valerie released a slow, measured breath, leaning back into the heavy ergonomic chair. She moved her hand away from the glowing keyboard and rested it gently against her lower abdomen. 12 weeks. The child she carried was a secret she had guarded with terrifying precision, knowing that the moment the underworld discovered her condition, she would be reduced to a biological vault for an arrogant heir. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the insulated silence of her high-tech sanctuary wash over her. There were no arrogant socialites here. There was no suffocating scent of foreign perfume clinging to her husband's collar. There was only the absolute security she had built with her own intellect, and the medical reality she had confirmed with Dr. Ward just yesterday. The console chimed aggressively, dragging her hyper-vigilant mind back to the monitors. The primary accounts were already drained, but Vincent still held a labyrinth of secondary assets. Shell companies masking luxury real estate acquisitions, phantom logistics firms, and unregulated shipping manifests. If he accessed those pipelines, he could liquidate enough capital to hire independent tracking teams. Valerie's jaw tightened. She was not going to leave him a single weapon. Her hands flew across the keys in a blur of tactical muscle memory, sealing away his subsidiary holding firms. One by one, the icons representing the syndicate's hidden wealth flickered and died, their funds rendered entirely inaccessible. Vincent had treated her as a helpless dependent, completely oblivious to the fact that she was the architect of his digital supremacy. Now he was trapped in a cage of her design. She took a sip of cold water, her pulse steady and calm. Let his empire burn. 5 miles away, freezing rain lashed against the blacked-out windows of a heavily armored SUV. Vincent sat in the cavernous rear cabin, his massive frame perfectly still, though his internal cognitive loop spiraled into chaos. The memory of the medical diagnostic report and the platinum wedding band played on an agonizing, continuous loop in his mind. The vehicle lurched to a halt outside a towering luxury high-rise, a building he owned entirely, through one of his now frozen shell companies. He did not wait for his security detail to open his door. He stepped out into the freezing deluge, the icy water, soaking instantly into his bespoke charcoal suit. He didn't feel the cold. The only thing registering in his hyper-vigilant state was a suffocating, violent need for answers. Minutes later, the heavy, soundproofed doors of a luxury penthouse suite splintered inward with a deafening crack. The rich mahogany frame shattered into jagged shards across the plush Persian rug as Vincent crossed the threshold. He moved with the devastating kinetic force of a localized hurricane. The opulent, velvet-draped living room was instantly consumed by his terrifying presence. Elena stood by the marble fireplace, draped in a silk robe, holding a crystal glass of imported champagne. The condescending smirk the mistress usually wore vanished the second she saw the lethal, dead expression in his dark eyes. The cloying, heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume, the exact same scent that had triggered Valerie's silent departure, hit Vincent's senses like a physical poison. It made his stomach heave with visceral disgust. He closed the distance between them in 3 rapid predatory strides. Elena dropped the baccarat crystal glass. It shattered against the marble hearth, the expensive champagne pooling like spilled blood across the white stone. She stumbled backward, her knees buckling under the sheer weight of his silent fury. The cruel socialite who had openly mocked his wife just hours earlier was instantly reduced to a trembling, pathetic coward. She raised her manicured hands, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob before he even spoke a word. "Where are your phone logs?" Vincent's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room with lethal, vibrating authority. He did not touch her. His absolute, freezing stillness was far more terrifying than a physical strike. "Did you speak to her? Did you trigger this, Vincent?" I don't understand," she stammered, tears ruining her meticulous makeup as she pressed her bare shoulders against the cold stone of the fireplace. "What happened? I haven't spoken to anyone. I swear to you, you're scaring me." He stared at her weeping, fragile form, and a sickening wave of realization washed over him. This shallow, panicking creature was the reason. He had neglected the brilliant, unbreakable tactician who was currently carrying his only bloodline. The contrast was physically nauseating. Valerie had never cowered. When faced with his profound betrayal, his wife had simply audited his entire life, dismantled his untouchable empire, and vanished. Elena was utterly useless. She possessed no tactical value, no loyalty, and no intellectual strength. He felt entirely exhausted. His arrogant pride replaced by a hollow, gnawing panic that threatened to rip his chest open. Before he could demand the digital devices from the weeping woman, the shattered doorway was filled by the imposing frame of Marco. The lead enforcer held a ringing, heavy-duty encrypted satellite phone, his expression grim against the chaotic domestic scene. Marco ignored the mistress entirely, stepping over the broken glass to present a glowing tactical map on a secondary tablet. The screen was covered in flashing red hazard icons. "Boss," Marco said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of emotion. "We have a critical escalation on the ground. Alexei Kozlov is mobilizing." His forward scouts noticed the sudden blackout in our operational funds. "They think we're bleeding out and they are taking immediate advantage." Vincent did not even glance at the tablet. He kept his hollow gaze fixed on the rain, lashing against the floor-to-soiling windows, his mind entirely consumed by the echoing silence of his empty master bedroom. "Alexei's men just breached the primary logistics hub," Marco continued, his finger tapping a localized perimeter on the screen, his tactical mind racing. "They are torching the warehouses. Millions in untraceable inventory are burning right now. If we do not dispatch the heavy response units immediately, Alexei Kozlov will seize the entire shipping corridor by sunrise. Let it burn." The words fell from Vincent's lips with a dead absolute certainty. Marco halted, his trained discipline fighting against the sheer insanity of the command. The seasoned enforcer lowered the tablet, staring at the syndicate lord who had spent a decade building that very shipping empire with fire and blood. "Sir," Marco pressed, his tone dropping to a dangerous baseline. "If we lose the primary logistics hub, the rival families will smell blood in the water. The organization will fracture before noon." Vincent finally turned, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his enforcer with a terrifying, hollow intensity. The ruthless mob boss didn't care about the burning warehouses, the illicit cargo, or the territorial prestige. Every single ounce of his vast wealth and power felt like worthless, suffocating ash compared to the agonizing, physical absence of his pregnant wife. "I said, let it burn to the ground," Vincent growled, his voice vibrating with a desperate, primal obsession that Marco had never witnessed before. "Pull every single armed man off the perimeter. Reroute the entire intelligence network. Valerie left a digital trace when she severed the secondary shell companies 5 minutes ago. You will isolate those coordinate leaks. You will find my wife, or I will bury this entire family in the ashes of the city myself. The storm outside the fortified downtown penthouse intensified, hammering the reinforced glass with a relentless, freezing rhythm. Valerie sat perfectly still in the glow of her ultra-wide monitors, her eyes tracing a sudden anomaly on the secondary perimeter feed. The digital map of her building flickered as 4 thermal heat signatures materialized in the subterranean parking garage. They were moving with a synchronized tactical fluidity that had nothing to do with standard building security. Alexei Kozlov had not just mobilized against the logistics hub. The rival syndicate leader had deployed a forward hunting team to exploit the financial chaos, somehow tracking the same encrypted ripple she had intentionally broadcasted to bait her husband. Valerie did not panic. Her pulse barely elevated above a steady clinical rhythm. She leaned forward, her slender fingers gliding across the mechanical keyboard with practiced lethality. The child she carried fluttered slightly, a faint somatic reminder of exactly what she was protecting. She exhaled a slow, controlled breath, calling up the building's architectural schematics. Kozlov's enforcers were bypassing the standard lobby, utilizing a maintenance freight elevator to ascend directly toward her 30th floor sanctuary. They were armed, carrying heavy breaching tools clearly visible on the high-definition X-ray scanners she had spliced into the structural grid. Let them come. She tapped a sequence of override commands, her eyes reflecting the scrolling green code. On the ground level, a fleet of blacked-out SUVs tore into the rain-slicked plaza, their heavy tires violently displacing the freezing water. Vincent had arrived. Through the external security feeds, she watched her husband's massive frame step out of the lead vehicle, his bespoke charcoal suit instantly soaked by the deluge. He looked entirely deranged, his usual aristocratic stillness replaced by a frantic, kinetic desperation. Marco Diaz and a dozen heavily armed loyalists fanned out behind him, their tactical flashlights cutting through the dark, as they spotted the rival transport vans idling in the loading bay. Valerie watched Vincent's face on the high-resolution camera. The absolute terror in his dark eyes was visceral. He was screaming a command, his chest heaving, believing he was about to watch his pregnant wife be slaughtered by a rival cartel. He thought she was still the fragile accessory he had left in his mansion. He was about to learn exactly who he had married. The rival hit squad reached the 29th floor. Valerie hit the execution key. The heavy freight elevator shuddered violently on the monitors as she severed the primary winch controls and engaged the emergency electromagnetic brakes. The steel box slammed to a brutal, bone-jarring halt between the 28th and 29th floors. Before Kozlov's men could recover from the kinetic shock and force the cabin doors open, Valerie activated the secondary countermeasures. With 3 precise keystrokes, she dropped the massive titanium blast doors across the exterior maintenance shafts, sealing the assassins inside a pressurized, inescapable steel tomb. She didn't bother deploying the standard lethal gas protocols or the high-frequency sonic deterrents. She simply disabled the internal oxygen circulation and plunged their cramped, confined space into total, blinding darkness. They were entirely neutralized in less than 14 seconds, trapped in a cage she controlled. Down in the plaza, Vincent froze mid-stride. He stared through the driving rain at the glowing security panel. In the lobby, as the building's mainframe broadcasted the localized containment alert. The heavy digital locks engaged across the entire glass facade, turning the luxury high-rise into a sealed, impenetrable vault. The underworld king stood paralyzed in the freezing storm, his custom firearm hanging uselessly at his side. He watched the automated defense grid systematically dismantle a highly trained hit squad, without a single bullet being fired. The crushing realization washed over him, dropping his core temperature lower than the winter winds howling through the concrete canyons. His wife did not need his protection. She had never needed it. She was a lethal architect of her own survival, and standing at the center of her technological web, she was entirely untouchable. The sterile blue light of the penthouse servers shifted to a soft, warning amber, as Valerie, manually disengaged the lobby lockdown for a single biometric signature. She wanted him to come up. She needed to sever the final strings of his arrogance face to face. Leaving him in the dark was a tactical move, but watching him witness his own ruin was a necessity for her peace of mind. She turned away from the thermal feeds, her hand resting instinctively over the soft curve of her cashmere sweater. The quiet hum of the climate control masked the faint sound of the private elevator engaging, rising steadily toward her floor. When the heavy steel doors finally parted, the man who stepped into her sanctuary barely resembled the syndicate lord she had lived with for 2 years. Vincent looked entirely shattered. His expensive tailored wool jacket was soaked through, clinging to his massive frame, dripping freezing rainwater onto her pristine hardwood floors. His chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths, his usually immaculate hair plastered wildly across his forehead. But it was his eyes that struck her. The cold, calculating void that had always terrified his enemies was completely gone. In its place was a bloodshot, agonizing panic, a raw, exposed vulnerability that stripped away every layer of his lethal reputation. He took one trembling step forward, his gaze locking onto her standing calmly behind the massive server console. His knees buckled slightly, a micro-expression of overwhelming relief, causing a physical tremor to rip through his broad shoulders. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, suffocated by the sheer gravity of her presence. "Stop right there," Valerie commanded. Her voice was not a hysterical scream. It was a low, absolute decree that echoed through the quiet room with chilling authority. Vincent froze instantly. He did not issue a counter-order. He did not demand her submission. He simply stopped, his large hands rising slowly in a gesture of total surrender, a man entirely at the mercy of the woman he had severely neglected. Valerie raised her right hand, resting her thumb gently over a custom-built, matte black tactical detonator. It was a localized hardware trigger, synced directly to the Aegis cipher key, currently embedded in her terminal. "You took a massive risk coming here, Vincent. Kozlov's men are suffocating in the elevator shaft, but his main forces will trace the lockdown eventually. You brought a war to my doorstep." "Valerie," he rasped, his voice tearing as if he had swallowed shattered glass. The sound was so broken it barely registered as his own. "I didn't bring them. I abandoned everything to find you. The logistics hub is burning. I let it burn. I don't care about the territory. I don't care about the accounts." He took another desperate, agonizing half-step, his eyes dropping to her abdomen for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her face. The reality of the medical diagnostic report hung between them, heavy and suffocating. "I saw the report on the desk. You are carrying my child. You are out here alone, and I have destroyed everything." "You didn't destroy it," she corrected, her thumb hovering millimeters above the trigger. "I did. This detonator is linked to the primary server architecture of your remaining legal fronts. If I press this, the shell companies, the real estate holdings, the political bribery ledgers, they all format, irrecoverable. Your empire becomes a ghost story in the span of 3 seconds." Vincent stared at the small black device. There was a time when a threat against his syndicate would have resulted in an immediate, brutal retaliation. Now, looking at the brilliant, unyielding woman standing before him in the sterile blue light of the server array, he felt absolutely nothing for the wealth he was about to lose. He slowly dropped to his knees, the wet fabric of his trousers slapping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The untouchable king of the underworld knelt before his pregnant wife, his broad shoulders shaking as the adrenaline crashed out of his system, leaving only the suffocating, devastating weight of his own profound regret. The heavy, pressurized silence of the sanctuary was broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of the underworld king fighting for oxygen. Vincent knelt on the polished hardwood, the freezing rainwater from his ruined bespoke jacket dripping steadily onto the floorboards, pooling around his knees in dark, spreading stains. He did not look at the matte black tactical detonator resting beneath Valerie's thumb. He did not glance at the ultra-wide monitors, displaying the shattered remnants of his digital infrastructure. His bloodshot eyes were locked entirely on her face, searching for a fraction of the quiet, obedient woman he had left behind at the mansion. She was gone. In her place stood a sovereign architect of ruin, and the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic misjudgment was physically crushing him. Valerie watched him with a hyper-vigilant, clinical detachment. Her pulse remained perfectly steady, though a faint, unexpected tightness gripped her chest. She analyzed his micro-expressions, scanning the rigid tension in his jaw and the violent tremor shaking his broad shoulders. She expected a sudden burst of violent pride. She anticipated the ruthless mob boss to demand his leverage back, to negotiate a hostile truce using his physical presence as a threat. Instead, the man slowly reached a trembling hand inside the breast pocket of his soaked wool coat. Her thumb tensed over the kill switch, the encrypted signal ready to instantly wipe his legal holding firms from existence. But Vincent did not draw a weapon. He pulled out a thick, water-damaged leather folio. His massive, scarred fingers struggled to undo the brass clasp, his fine motor skills completely compromised by the massive adrenaline crash. He managed to open the flap, placing the heavy leather binder on the floor before sliding it across the smooth wood. It came to a halt inches from her leather boots. "I don't care about the accounts," Vincent rasped, his voice tearing violently in his throat. He kept his hands open and visible, pressing his palms against his wet thighs. "I don't care about the shell companies or the territory, or the offshore reserves you locked down. Format the drives, Valerie. Burn the rest of it to the ground. That folio contains the irrevocable syndicate transition deeds. I had my legal team draft them in the SUV while Marco was isolating your digital trace." Valerie briefly lowered her gaze to the damp documents protruding from the leather sleeve. They were heavily notarized legal instruments. Complete corporate restructuring forms, bearer bond transfers, and proxy board assignments for the entirety of his commercial real estate empire. He was not offering a temporary truce. He had meticulously and legally signed over the absolute ownership of his criminal and legitimate infrastructure to her name. He was surrendering his crown. "Every voting share, every blind trust, every logistical pipeline is yours," he continued, the words spilling from his lips in a desperate, broken cadence. "I am stripping myself of all authority. You hold the keys. You hold the capital. You are the only recognized head of this family now. I am making myself your subordinate, legally and permanently." A single drop of freezing rainwater fell from his bruised cheekline, splashing against the hardwood. The apex predator of the city was openly weeping. There were no loud theatrical wails, just the raw, silent, shuddering sobs of a man whose chest was caving in under the weight of his own profound remorse. "I was a blind, arrogant fool. I paraded my ego while you sat in the shadows, enduring my cruelty, holding my entire world together. I treated you like a fragile accessory, and it took you dismantling my life in 3 hours for me to truly see you. I am completely at your mercy, Valerie." He bowed his head, his dark, wet hair obscuring his eyes as his massive frame shook. "I know I do not deserve your forgiveness. I am not asking for my power back. I am only asking for the right to stand at your door. Let me be the shield between you and Kozlov. Let me protect our child. I will sleep in the hallway. I will take the bullets meant for your windows. Just do not erase them from your life." Valerie stared down at the kneeling giant. The situational irony was absolute. The man who had commanded armies of enforcers and controlled the city's political elite was now begging for the privilege of being her personal bodyguard. She carefully analyzed the legal documents at her feet, then looked at the tactical detonator in her palm. The absolute terror and devastating sincerity radiating from his physical posture could not be faked. He had completely disarmed himself, offering his throat to the blade she wielded. Slowly, deliberately, Valerie lifted her thumb off the matte black device. She did not press the kill switch. She set the detonator down onto the cool metal surface of the server console. "The terms of this alliance are entirely non-negotiable," Valerie stated, her voice a smooth, unyielding blade cutting through the ambient hum of the cooling fans. "You will never disrespect me again. You will never attempt to bypass my digital authorizations. If you ever bring the scent of betrayal, arrogance, or another woman into my orbit, I will not just format the drives, I will vanish, and you will never find a single trace of me or this child again. Do you understand?" "I swear it," Vincent whispered instantly, his head snapping up, a desperate, frantic hope igniting in his bloodshot eyes. "My life is yours. My loyalty is absolute. I swear it on my soul." Valerie reached into the pocket of her structured cashmere sweater. She pulled out a small folded piece of glossy thermal paper. It was the pregnancy ultrasound from Dr. Ward's clinic. A grainy, black and white static image that held infinitely more power than the billions of dollars currently frozen in his offshore accounts. She unfolded it meticulously and placed it on the edge of the mahogany desk, right beside the glowing red indicator of her Aegis cipher key. "Stand up," she commanded quietly. Vincent obeyed, his massive, soaked frame rising slowly from the floor. Even completely exhausted and dripping with freezing rain, he towered over her, casting a long, imposing shadow across the sterile blue light of the server array. Yet, his posture remained entirely bowed, his broad shoulders curved inward in a permanent state of deference to the woman standing before him. Valerie took a single step forward, closing the tactical distance between them. She reached out, grasping his heavy, scarred right wrist. His skin was freezing to the touch, vibrating with the residual shock of the adrenaline crash. She guided his massive hand downward, pressing his trembling palm flat against the soft cashmere, covering her lower abdomen. The moment his skin made contact with the subtle curve of her stomach, a profound, somatic tremor ripped through his entire body. Vincent released a ragged, suffocating gasp, his eyes falling shut as tears mixed with the rainwater on his face. The primal reality of his bloodline, growing safely beneath the unyielding shield of her intellect, anchored his fractured mind. The cold, calculating monster who had terrorized the city was entirely subdued, replaced by a devoted, obsessive protector. He fell forward slightly, resting his forehead against her shoulder, exhaling a breath that sounded like a decade of tension leaving his bones. Valerie did not pull away. She allowed the heavy, wet weight of his embrace to ground her, her own hands resting lightly against the damp wool of his ruined jacket. Outside the bulletproof glass, the winter storm continued to lash against the city, but the interior of the fortified penthouse remained completely untouchable. The arrogant king of the underworld had been systematically broken and humbled, yielding his entire empire to the quiet, brilliant woman he had once ignored. She was no longer a temporary paper wife. She was forged in fire and steel, standing at the absolute pinnacle of his world. Wrapped in the heavy, lingering silence of their new sovereign pact, she looked past his shoulder at the flashing green codes of her secure network. The transition was complete. Do you think his punishment and surrender were enough to earn his place by her side? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to never miss the next chapter of their unyielding reign.